Rosalie stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she collapsed against the door, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. "Please, my baby," she whispered, barely audible. Jesse Langdon, the man she'd once known in another lifetime, appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with recognition. "You, after all these years," he muttered, his voice rough with disbelief. As if on instinct, he caught her before she could hit the ground. His arms were steady, a silent promise breaking free from a time long buried. "You're home now," he whispered, the words carrying both an apology and a vow. A promise made long ago, a promise broken by time. 7 years ago, he'd been a broken man, lost in grief after the death of his wife and child. But now, as he looked down at her, exhaustion in her eyes and hope desperately clinging to what little was left of her strength, he wasn't sure what was real anymore. Rosalie was here, and somehow, against all odds, he hadn't turned away. But what had brought her to his door after all this time? What had led her to run halfway across the wilderness in the dead of night with a fevered child in her arms? And would the two of them survive what was coming next? The answers came in pieces, scattered across the 3 days she'd just fled from. A threat from her past, a cruel ultimatum that had left her no choice but to turn to the man who had once promised her safety. 3 days ago, Harper had demanded that Rosalie marry him, or he'd sell her son Eli to work in the factory. He'd forced her to make an impossible choice, and with nowhere else to turn, she remembered the man she'd once known, the man who had promised her help if she ever needed it. She didn't have much left, but she had hope. And as they made the 20-mile journey through the harsh wilderness, through exhaustion and hunger, she held onto that hope, telling Eli's stories of better days, of Jesse Langdon's promise. By the 3rd day, Eli's fever had worsened, and Rosalie could barely stay upright as she crawled the final stretch. When she finally reached Jesse's door and knocked weakly, she collapsed in a heap, hoping beyond hope that she had not come too late. The door opened, and Jesse, still not fully believing his own eyes, caught her before she could fall. She was here against all odds, and now, somehow, she was home. Jesse didn't waste a moment. As soon as Rosalie was inside, he tended to Eli first, his hand steady but quick as he wiped the fevered boy's brow, coaxing water into him until the fever finally broke. Only then did he turn to Rosalie, his gaze scanning the battered woman lying on the bed. Her feet were bloodied, her body bruised from the harsh journey, and her face pale, but her eyes held a mix of relief and terror. She stirred slightly, her lips parting as she gasped, "Eli." The panic in her voice was instant, and Jesse reassured her gently, "He's safe. He's right here." She let out a shaky breath, her eyes flitting to her son, who was now resting, his fever cooling. Rosalie's body seemed to relax, but her mind remained sharp, processing the pain of everything that had brought her here. Her body was worn, but her spirit wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. As she sank into the bed, exhausted and hollow, she realized just how desperate she'd been, how deep her fear had run, and how she never thought she'd be here again, inside Jesse's home, under his care, after all these years. She had run. She had fled in the middle of the night, with no other option left except for Jesse. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you tell me to come if I needed help?" Jesse paused for a long moment, his face hardening as he tried to suppress the rage simmering beneath the surface. His jaw clenched, but his gaze softened as he answered, "Because I owed you. Because you kept me alive when I didn't want to live." The weight of those words hung in the air between them, as if the past 7 years had never really gone away, as if time had somehow folded back on itself. He had been a broken man when he'd lost his wife and child, lost in grief, wanting nothing more than to fade away. But Rosalie's quiet kindness had pulled him from the depths, her young, innocent care that had kept him tethered to life. She had shown him something he had forgotten existed: hope. And so, In his own way, he had promised her years ago that if she ever needed help, he would be there. But after losing everything, after burying himself in work and isolation, Jesse had never expected to see her again. He had known she'd carry that promise with her. Rosalie closed her eyes, a wave of emotion flooding over her. She hadn't forgotten him, not for a moment. She had buried her grief, her losses, her fears, and she had kept on, one step in front of the other, until she had run out of road and out of options. After her parents died, after her husband Thomas Quinn had died, and after the mounting debts left her with no way out, she hadn't known where to turn. Until the night Harper had come for her, giving her the ultimatum, the cruel demand to marry him or lose her son forever. She had no choice but to leave. And so she had remembered Jesse, the man who had once promised her protection, a way out. And now here they were, both of them, facing the ghosts of the past and the harsh reality of what lay ahead. Jesse sat by the bed, his eyes lost in the past, in the things he had never said. But Rosalie, exhausted from the journey and overwhelmed by everything, was fighting to stay awake. Her voice was fragile as she spoke, the words tumbling out like pieces of a shattered puzzle. I don't know what to do. I've lost everything, Jesse. He turned toward her, his eyes fierce with protective fury. You haven't lost everything. You got me now, and I'll make sure you don't lose anything else. Her eyes searched his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Jesse was a man of few words, but his actions had always spoken volumes. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in this new life he was offering, even as the fear and pain of her past clung to her. I promised you I'd never let you fall, he continued, his voice soft but firm. And I meant it. The night stretched on, and Jesse worked tirelessly, moving between the two beds, making sure that both Rosalie and Eli had everything they needed. But all the while, his mind drifted back to that time, 7 years ago, to when he had been on the edge of losing everything, when grief had consumed him, and Rosalie had been the one to pull him back from the brink. He remembered how young she had been, how she had cared for him in that quiet, gentle way, never asking for anything in return. And he had made her a promise he had never forgotten. It had been a vow spoken with the quiet intensity of someone who had lost everything, and perhaps, in that moment, had only a sliver of hope left. But he had promised, if you ever need anything, I'll be there. It was that promise, that simple vow, that had brought her here. And it was that promise that kept him from turning away now. We'll figure this out, Jesse said, his voice raw with emotion. We'll figure it out together. As Rosalie drifted back to sleep, exhaustion overtaking her, Jesse stayed awake, the weight of the past heavy on his chest. He knew that Harper wouldn't let them be. He knew that there would be more to face, more battles to fight. But for the first time in years, Jesse felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. They would make it through this. Somehow they would make it through, and he would keep his promise no matter the cost. And as the night wore on, the sound of steady breathing from both Rosalie and Eli filled the room, and Jesse Langdon finally allowed himself to hope again. The days passed slowly, but with a strange sense of comfort that Rosalie had never known before. Jesse had taken to quietly looking after her, and Eli, his actions speaking louder than any words he could muster. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had been alone for years, but there was a tenderness in the way he looked after them, like he had finally found a reason to care again. On the third day after their arrival, Eli woke from his fevered slumber, his eyes squinting as he tried to make sense of his new surroundings. The confusion on the boy's face made Rosalie's heart ache, but when Eli saw her beside him, his face lit up with relief, and his first words were, "Mama, you're here." The words hit her like a wave, flooding her with emotion, but she didn't let him see the tears that welled in her eyes. Jesse had already been by his side, feeding him small sips of water and offering comfort in silence. Rosalie's gaze met Jesse's over Eli's head, and for the first time in days, She let herself breathe deeply. "Thank you," she whispered to Jesse, who merely nodded in response, his eyes dark with the kind of pain she recognized well but didn't want to acknowledge. They were both broken, but in that moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. As the days went on, the unspoken connection between them deepened. Jesse allowed her to help around the house, to wash clothes, to make the simple meals. He didn't need her help, but it was as if he didn't know what to do with the silence that surrounded him, the emptiness that had lived with him for so long. Rosalie, for her part, found herself beginning to feel more like herself again. With each passing day, she grew stronger. But there was something more, something deeper than just recovery from physical exhaustion. She found herself watching Jesse with a new kind of awareness, noticing the small things, the way his hands moved as he worked, the quiet smile he gave to Eli when he helped him feed the chickens, the care he took with the horses. There was a softness in him that she hadn't expected. She had always known him to be strong and stoic, a man hardened by loss. But now she saw the cracks in that exterior. And as much as she tried to fight it, she couldn't help but feel drawn to him, drawn to the man he was becoming again. Eli, too, began to form a bond with Jesse that felt both fragile and enduring. Jesse spent hours teaching the boy how to care for the animals, how to tend to the farm, how to be gentle with the creatures they cared for. It was in these moments that Rosalie saw a side of Jesse she hadn't expected, a side that was tender, patient, and kind. She watched him carve small wooden animals for Eli, watched as the boy's face lit up with wonder and curiosity. She saw the way Jesse's walls slowly began to crack under Eli's innocent questions. "Why are you alone, Pa?" Eli had asked one evening, and Jesse's eyes had clouded with an emotion that Rosalie couldn't quite read. For a long moment, Jesse didn't speak, his hands frozen mid-motion as he worked. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I was alone because I didn't think I deserved anything more." The words hit her harder than she expected. In that instant, she saw the depth of his grief, the weight of the past that had been pulling him under for so long. It was as if the loss of his wife and child had branded him in a way he couldn't escape, had convinced him that he didn't deserve the happiness that was slowly slipping back into his life. But Rosalie saw something else, too. She saw how much Eli meant to him, how much he cared about the boy, and for the first time in a long while, she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. As the days turned into weeks, something shifted. The atmosphere in the small ranch house was filled with an easy, quiet warmth that hadn't existed before. Eli's laughter was a daily sound now, the walls of the home echoing with the simple joy of childhood. Jesse's gruff exterior began to soften, and for the first time in years, he smiled easily, genuinely. Rosalie watched this transformation with a growing sense of awe. He was healing too. Slowly, but surely, they were both healing. One evening, after a day of work on the ranch, Jesse sat on the porch, his rifle resting against the wall beside him as he watched Eli run around with the dogs, laughing. Rosalie came to sit beside him, and for a long time, they just sat there in silence, watching the boy. When the silence became too much to bear, Rosalie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd get here," she admitted, her eyes distant as she looked at the horizon. "I never thought I'd make it this far." Jesse didn't respond at first. He simply turned his gaze toward her, his eyes soft but filled with an understanding that only someone who had lived through pain could offer. "We're here now," he said, his voice low, steady. Rosalie turned to him, her heart beating louder in her chest. She saw him then, not just the man who had helped her, not just the man who had promised to keep her safe, but a man who had been broken and was now slowly, tentatively, allowing himself to heal. She realized, in that moment, how deeply she had come to care for him, how impossible it was to fight the growing warmth between them. That night, after Eli had fallen asleep, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames flickering between them. There was a careful distance between them, an unspoken understanding that they were both still figuring things out. But when Jesse spoke, his voice was steady, though there was an edge of vulnerability that Rosalie hadn't heard before. "You could stay, as long as you need." The words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken promise. But Rosalie, ever the realist, shook her head softly. "People will talk," she said, her voice low. "A widow and a widower, together?" Jesse didn't hesitate. "Let them talk," he said simply. "I stopped caring what this town thinks years ago." They both looked away at the same time, avoiding the obvious tension between them. Rosalie's heart raced in her chest, a mix of fear and something else, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But as the days passed, she couldn't deny that she was beginning to feel something for Jesse that went far beyond gratitude, beyond the bond they were building. It was something more, something complicated and terrifying. She had come here for safety, for protection, but somewhere along the way, she had started to wonder if this could be more than just survival. Could this be the beginning of something new? Something she had never dared to hope for? That night, alone in bed, she allowed herself to think of the possibilities. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She wasn't afraid of him. The stillness of the evening was broken by the sound of galloping hooves as the dust kicked up on the horizon, signaling the arrival of trouble. Jesse stood at the edge of the porch, his posture tense as he scanned the distance. His hand instinctively gripped the rifle that had been resting by his side for days now, ready for whatever was coming. Rosalie, inside the house with Eli, heard the hooves too, and felt the knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew who it was. It was Harper, and he was here to take what he believed was his. Jesse's voice was steady as he called for Rosalie, his eyes still locked on the approaching riders. "Get Eli to the root cellar. Now." Rosalie froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The urgency in Jesse's voice made her heart race, but she quickly grabbed Eli, still asleep, and rushed to the cellar, her mind swirling with fear for both her son and the man she had come to care for more than she was ready to admit. Jesse, meanwhile, stood his ground as Harper and his two hired guns rode into view, their horses kicking up dirt as they stopped just a few yards away. Harper's cold eyes met Jesse's as he dismounted, a fake smile plastered on his face. Well, Jesse langed in. Harper said with mock politeness, "It's been a while. I didn't expect you to be standing in my way." Jesse didn't flinch. "You've got nothing here, Harper. She's my property," Harper sneered, motioning to the house where Rosalie had just disappeared. "She's a thief and a debtor. You're just hiding her." Langdon. Jesse's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward, his boots scraping against the dirt. "She's not yours. Not anymore." Harper's smirk faltered for just a moment, but it quickly returned as he reached for the rifle strapped to his back, testing Jesse's resolve. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, Jesse wondered if this would be the end. But he refused to back down. He wouldn't let Harper have Rosalie or Eli. He wouldn't let this man tear apart the fragile peace they had found. Harper's tone grew more sinister as he took another step toward Jesse, his fingers twitching near the gun. "You willing to die for this widow, Langdon? Is she worth that much to you?" Jesse's voice was calm, steady, but the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. "If that's what it takes." The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a threat all at once. Harper laughed bitterly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to throw Jesse off balance. "You're a fool," he said. "You don't know what you're getting into. You don't know what she's done." Jesse's fists clenched, but he didn't take the bait. He had heard enough. Harper's low blow about Jesse's first wife was the final straw. "How'd dying for women work with your first wife?" Harper's words were venomous, but Jesse's expression remained unchanged. "She was never yours, and neither is Rosalie." Jesse stepped forward, his eyes locked on Harper's as he made a decision that would change everything. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." Harper's men shifted, their hands hovering near their weapons, but Jesse stood firm, the rifle in his hand now raised slightly. There was no turning back. And then, in a moment of defiance, Jesse did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill, handing it to Harper. "I'll give you $50, Jesse said, his voice cold. "You take that, and you leave. You never come back." Harper looked at the money, then back at Jesse with a mixture of disbelief and anger. $50? You think you can buy her off with this? "You came here to take something that's not yours," Jesse said, his eyes unwavering. "But I won't let you have her. If you need money, I'll give you that. But it ends today." Harper's eyes flickered with rage, but Jesse's calmness only seemed to enrage him more. "You think I'm scared of you, Langdon?" Harper sneered. "I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. The sheriff will come. There'll be an investigation. You won't get away with this." Jesse didn't flinch. He looked Harper dead in the eye and said, "Then I'll marry her." The words rang out, unexpected and final. The air seemed to freeze, and for a long moment, Harper and his men were silent. Jesse took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just said. "I'll marry her. Today. Right now." The declaration seemed to hang in the air between them, and Harper's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? You want to make this right? You want to take what's yours? Then I'll marry her. And I'll do it now," Jesse said, his voice firm. "You get your money. You get your revenge. But it ends today. No more threats. No more games." Harper's face twisted in anger, but Jesse stood his ground, unwavering. "You'll have your marriage certificate by the end of the day. You won't touch her again." Harper's eyes narrowed, his thoughts churning behind a mask of hatred. But he didn't challenge Jesse's resolve. Instead, with one last sneer, he motioned to his men. "You better be sure about this, Langdon. If you're lying, I'll be back. And I won't be alone." With that, Harper turned his horse around and rode off, his men following closely behind. Jesse stood there for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. He had promised Rosalie safety, and he had just made a decision that would change everything for both of them. But he couldn't help the feeling that it was the right choice, the only choice. Jesse turned toward the house, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his world had just shifted. He had just proposed to Rosalie, but not in the way he had imagined. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a promise to keep her safe, to stand by her, and to protect the future they were both building. Inside, Rosalie stood frozen in the doorway, watching him. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. She had heard the entire conversation from the root cellar, and now she was processing what had just happened. Jesse had proposed to her, not for love, but for survival, for protection. She didn't know what to feel. She didn't know if she should be grateful, angry, or terrified. But what she did know was that Jesse Langdon had just changed the course of both their lives. And as he walked toward her, rifle still in hand, there was no turning back. "You didn't have to," she said, her voice trembling. Jesse stopped in front of her, his eyes dark but steady. "Yes, I did," he said quietly, his hand reaching for hers. "And I meant it." The room was silent for a long moment as they both processed what had just happened. Jesse had just made a promise to her, a promise he couldn't take back. And Rosalie knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping the consequences of their choices. They were bound together now, for better or for worse. And as the sun began to set, they knew that they had no idea what the future would hold, but they would face it together. The days following Jesse's sudden proposal were filled with a mix of tension and anticipation, a strange quiet settling over the ranch as preparations for the wedding began. Jesse, ever the quiet man, rode into town alone, his mind clouded with thoughts of everything that had happened and everything that still could. His heart weighed heavy with the knowledge that he had just made a decision that would forever change his life. He hadn't expected to marry Rosalie out of necessity, but here he was, fulfilling a promise made in desperation. The journey to town was slow, the weight of the situation pressing down on him as he made his way to the sheriff's office to file for a marriage license. The paperwork was simple enough, but the act itself felt like a line crossed, one that would forever tie him to Rosalie and her son in ways he had never anticipated. He couldn't deny the responsibility he had just assumed, but there was a part of him that couldn't help but feel a sense of finality, as though this decision had been years in the making, even if he hadn't realized it. When Jesse returned, he had the license in his pocket and a bag of fabric draped over his shoulder, as simple, but enough, offering for Rosalie's wedding dress. He had also found a small silver ring, one that had once belonged to his grandmother, something he hadn't even known he had until he stumbled upon it while digging through an old chest in the barn. It felt like fate, that ring, like a symbol of the new beginning they both needed. Rosalie, when she saw him return, took the fabric from him silently, her hands shaking slightly as she held it in her grasp. She had agreed to this marriage, but there was a part of her that still couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened. Her heart ached with the weight of it all, but she couldn't deny that there was a piece of her that felt the pull of Jesse's quiet strength. Over the next few days, she sewed the fabric into a simple but beautiful dress, her movements steady as she worked by the light of a flickering oil lamp. Eli, now fully recovered, spent his days running around the yard, his laughter filling the air as he helped in any way he could. Jesse, for his part, worked tirelessly around the ranch, his hands never still as he prepared for the wedding in his own way, by making sure everything was ready, that everything would go smoothly. He wasn't one for grand gestures or speeches, but he knew how to care for those he loved, even if he didn't always know how to show it. The wedding day came, and as Rosalie stood in front of the small mirror in the corner of their makeshift room, she gazed at the reflection of herself in the simple dress. It wasn't a gown fit for royalty, but it was hers, and it was enough. Eli stood beside her, his eyes wide with excitement as he watched his mother adjust her dress, the final touches just beginning. Jesse, meanwhile, stood in front of the house, looking at the land he had worked so hard to keep, his thoughts a swirl of uncertainty and hope. He didn't know what would come of this marriage. He didn't know what the future would hold. But in that moment, as he looked out over the land, he knew one thing for sure. He would protect Rosalie and Eli with everything he had. As the sun began to set, the small ceremony was held on the porch, the only witnesses being a neighboring rancher and his wife, two quiet souls who had known Jesse for years. The pastor Jesse had paid arrived with the simple vows, and they stood together in the fading light, a sense of peace settling over them both. Jesse's hand shook slightly as he took the ring from his pocket, slipping it onto Rosalie's finger as he spoke the words that would bind them together. "I do," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a lifetime of unspoken promises. Rosalie, her face flushed with emotion, whispered her own vows, her voice trembling as she spoke the words she hadn't thought she would say. "I do," she said softly, and in that moment, everything changed. The kiss they shared was simple but full of meaning, a seal on a promise that neither of them had fully understood until now. It was a kiss of survival, of hope, and of second chances. The small celebration that followed was intimate, a meal shared between the three of them, the laughter of Eli filling the air. There was no grand music, no grand dance. Instead, Jesse took Rosalie's hand and spun her on the porch, the moment feeling like the culmination of everything they had fought for. Eli joined them, and the three of them danced under the stars, a quiet joy that spoke of the future they were now building together. But as the night wore on, the faint sound of hoofbeats in the distance broke the fragile peace. Jesse's instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed the rifle that had become a constant companion in recent days and walked slowly to the porch. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the figure riding toward them, a lone man on horseback, his silhouette outlined by the moonlight. Harper had returned. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Jesse's hand tightened around the rifle. He could feel Rosalie's presence behind him, a silent reassurance that she was there. But this time there was no fear. Jesse had made a promise to her, and he would keep it. As Harper rode closer, his face twisted with anger, Jesse stepped forward to meet him. Harper dismounted, his eyes narrowed, bloodshot with anger and alcohol. "You think you won?" he spat, his voice slurred. "You think you're going to get away with this?" Jesse didn't flinch. "I don't need to get away with anything," he said calmly. "You're done. Harper, leave now and don't come back." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened between them. Harper's gaze flickered from Jesse to the house, and for the first time, Jesse saw the raw emotion in the other man's eyes. "She was supposed to be mine," Harper muttered, his voice cracking. "She was supposed to be mine, and you took her from me." Jesse's voice was steady but filled with finality. "She was never yours." And then Harper's face crumpled. The anger drained from him as he looked at Rosalie, his gaze shifting to the barely noticeable bump of her pregnancy, a realization hitting him harder than anything Jesse could have said. "You." His voice trailed off as he realized the truth. He had lost. "You're going to have a child, aren't you?" he said bitterly. Rosalie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Jesse took one step forward, the rifle now fully raised, his posture unwavering. "Leave. Don't ever come back." Harper's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Jesse thought he might draw his own gun. But instead, Harper's shoulders slumped in defeat, his body language collapsing in on itself. "You've won, Langdon," he muttered, turning away and mounting his horse. "But don't think it's over." With that, Harper rode off into the night, his presence now a fading memory. Jesse stood in silence for a moment, his hands still clutching the rifle, the weight of the moment settling in. Rosalie stepped forward, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes soft but filled with gratitude. "It's over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're safe." Jesse nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of everything they had just been through. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He turned to Rosalie, his eyes soft as he said, "You're safe now. You're home." She smiled at him, the first genuine smile he had seen in days. And in that moment, Jesse knew that everything had changed. The life they had built together, the family they had created, was finally theirs to keep. And as the moonlight bathed the ranch in a soft glow, they both knew that they had won. Harper was gone, and their future was just beginning. The night that followed Harper's final stand was a quiet one, the kind of stillness that settled deep into the bones. Jesse sat beside Rosalie in their small bedroom, the warmth of her presence filling the room in a way he hadn't known he needed. He could feel the faint tremor in her hand as she lay beside him, her fingers brushing his as if to reassure herself that they were both still here, still safe. He hadn't been able to protect everything he loved, not before, but now. With her beside him, he felt something stronger than the pain of past losses. He felt a possibility, a future. "A baby?" Jesse whispered, his voice raw with emotion as he turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. Rosalie's smile was tender, but it was the kind of smile that held so many emotions behind it: fear, hope, love, and the realization of what this child meant. "Our baby," she murmured, her voice soft, her hand resting lightly over her belly. Jesse's throat tightened as he reached for her hand, feeling the slight movement beneath her skin, the small life that was growing inside her. "I thought I'd never." After losing, his voice faltered, the weight of the years of grief and loss threatening to swallow him whole. Rosalie gently placed her hand over his, a silent comfort in the dim light of the room. "This is different," she said softly, her eyes locking with his. "We're different. We've been through so much already. But we're going to make it, Jesse. We're going to make it together." A tear slipped down his cheek as he kissed her forehead, his hand resting on her belly, feeling the promise of their future in that small, fragile movement. "You're my miracle," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, and Rosalie smiled, the glow of something pure shining in her eyes. The morning came slowly, a soft light breaking through the window as the day began. Jesse awoke to the sound of birds outside, to the warmth of Rosalie still beside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. They had already overcome so much, so many struggles, so many losses, but they were here, together, and that was all that mattered. As the weeks passed, the ranch began to come to life in a way it never had before. Rosalie, now pregnant and glowing with life, spent her days working in the garden, her hands carefully tending to the plants that would one day feed them. Eli, no longer the sick child he had been when they first arrived, grew stronger every day, his laughter filling the air as he ran around the yard, his confidence growing with every new skill he learned. Jesse, for his part, was more than just a protector now. He was a father, a partner, a man who had rediscovered his purpose. The work on the ranch continued, but there was a lightness to it now, a sense of joy in the small things. Eli helped Jesse feed the horses, learned how to fix things around the ranch, and even managed to carve his first wooden animal with the same patience that Jesse had shown him. Every day, Jesse found himself marveling at how much their lives had changed. The quiet, lonely existence he had once led was now filled with noise, with laughter, with the sound of a family growing together. One evening, as Jesse worked on the fence, Eli came running toward him, a wide grin on his face. "Pa, Mama says breakfast," Eli exclaimed, and Jesse chuckled as he scooped the boy up into his arms, spinning him around before carrying him toward the house. Rosalie stood in the doorway, a smile on her face as she watched them approach. Jesse's heart swelled with love for both of them, and as he kissed Rosalie's forehead, his hand rested gently on her belly. "How's our little one?" he asked softly, his voice full of wonder. Rosalie placed her hand over his, feeling the gentle flutter of the baby inside. "She's growing," Rosalie said with a soft smile, her eyes filled with a love that made Jesse's heart ache with gratitude. "We're going to be just fine," she added, her voice filled with the kind of certainty that came only after weathering storms. And they were. They were going to be fine. The town, which had once whispered about them, now nodded in respect when they passed by. The judgment that had once clouded their lives was gone, replaced by quiet admiration for what they had built together. Jesse, Rosalie, and Eli had forged a life in the ashes of the past, a life that was theirs to keep. They were no longer the broken people who had stumbled into each other's lives by chance. They were a family built from the ground up with love as the foundation. As the days passed, the seasons began to change. Spring arrived in full bloom, bringing new life to the land and to their hearts. Rosalie's belly grew rounder, and every day, she and Jesse worked side by side, their bond growing stronger with every shared task. They laughed together, joked together, and in the quiet moments, they found peace in each other's presence. Eli was becoming a young man, strong and confident, and Jesse couldn't help but feel a swell of pride every time he looked at him. The ranch was thriving, and with each passing day, their future felt more secure. But even with all the peace they had found, life had one more surprise for them. Late one evening, as Rosalie sat with her feet up, reading a book, she felt a sharp pain in her stomach. Panic rose in her chest as she placed a hand over her belly, but it wasn't long before the pain passed. It was a sign that the time was drawing near. Jesse, ever the protector, was at her side in an instant, his worry etched across his face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. "It's just labor," Rosalie said, trying to calm him, though her own nerves were fraying. "It's time." Jesse nodded, his face set in determination as he rushed to gather everything they might need. Eli, who had been playing outside, ran inside at the sound of his mother's voice. He looked up at Jesse, his eyes wide with concern. Is Mama okay? He asked softly. Mama's fine, Jesse said, giving Eli a reassuring smile. But we're going to need you to help take care of the animals while we're busy inside. Can you do that for me? Eli nodded eagerly, his face set with the seriousness of the moment. I can do it, Pa, he said, his voice filled with determination. Rosalie smiled as she watched her son, the boy who had once been weak and sick now growing into a young man who could hold his own. She turned to Jesse, who was busy preparing everything for the birth. We're really doing this, aren't we? She asked, her voice filled with wonder. Jesse stopped what he was doing and turned to her, his eyes filled with nothing but love. We're doing this, he said softly. We're building a family, Rosalie. We've made it this far. We'll make it the rest of the way together. And they did. Hours later, in the warmth of their home, with the sounds of the ranch outside, Rosalie gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Her cries filled the room, and Jesse, tears in his eyes, cut the cord with hands that were trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of it all. He placed his daughter in Rosalie's arms, his heart full of love and gratitude. She's perfect, Rosalie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She's ours. Jesse kissed her forehead, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch their daughter. She's perfect, he echoed. In the months that followed, life on the ranch continued to flourish. Eli, now 6 years old, helped more than ever, tending to the animals and helping around the house. The ranch was thriving, the family was complete, and the whispers from the town had long since turned into nods of approval. It was hard to believe how far they had come from those dark days when Rosalie had collapsed at Jesse's door, starving and broken. Now, their lives were filled with laughter, love, and hope. And when Eli asked Rosalie to tell the story again, the story of how they had found each other, she smiled and began, Well, baby, I collapsed at his door, starving and broken. Jesse joined in, his voice soft but strong. And I lifted her and said, They both said together, you're home now. And in that moment, they were home. And they always would be. The sun set over their thriving ranch. And as they stood together, a family complete, Jesse and Rosalie knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The home they had built from the ashes was more than just a place. It was a life, a love, and a future that was theirs to keep.